Picture a gleaming Chicago train station, alive with hurried footsteps. Nia Jackson, a black biotech titan, steps into the Silver Line's VIP car, ticket in hand, bound for a life-changing New York conference. Then Margaret Voss, a white woman dripping with privilege, demands Nia's seat. The conductor boots Nia out, but one call later, the whole staff's fired. Yet as the train rolls away, Nia's stranded, her dreams dangling by a thread. How did a simple seat spark this chaos? Before we dive in, where are you watching from? If you stand for justice, hit like, subscribe, and join us for more epic showdowns. What exploded here? 30 minutes before chaos erupted on the Chicago platform, Nia Jackson stepped onto the Silver Line's VIP car with the quiet confidence of someone who'd fought for every inch of her success. Her tailored navy suit hugged her frame, the crisp white blouse beneath it glowing against her deep brown skin. She carried a sleek leather satchel slung over one shoulder, her ticket for seat 1A pinched between her fingers. The train's interior smelled of polished wood and faint lavender, a luxury she'd earned after years clawing her way up from a cramped apartment in Atlanta to the helm of a biotech empire. Today, she was headed to New York, where a conference, keynote could cement a deal worth millions, a chance to shove her company's name into the global spotlight. She exhaled, settling into the plush leather of 1A, her window seat framing the bustling station beyond the glass. For a moment, everything felt right. The peace shattered when Margaret Voss swept into the car like a storm cloud in designer heels. Her platinum blonde hair was swept into a tight chignon, and a massive diamond gleamed on her left hand, catching the overhead lights. She wore a cream cashmere coat that screamed money, her posture rigid with the kind of entitlement that didn't ask permission. Trailing her was a mousy assistant, a young woman with a pinched face clutching a tablet, her eyes darting nervously. Margaret's gaze landed on Nia, and her lips twitched into something between a smirk and a scowl. She stopped dead beside Nia's row, her shadow falling across the armrest. The assistant hovered behind, tapping furiously on her device, as if documenting the moment for posterity. "Excuse me," Margaret said, her voice clipped and dripping with disdain. "I believe you're in my seat." Nia glanced up, her brow furrowing slightly as she met Margaret's icy blue stare. She didn't flinch, didn't shift. "This is 1A," Nia replied, her tone even, measured. "I booked it 3 months ago. Here's my ticket." She slid, the crisp paper from her satchel, holding it out with a steady hand. Margaret didn't even glance at it. Instead, she waved a dismissive hand, her manicured nails flashing red. "There's obviously been a mistake," she snapped. "I'm a platinum tier member with Silver Line. This is my usual seat. You'll need to move." Nia's jaw tightened, but her face stayed calm, a mask honed from years of boardroom battles. She'd heard this tone before, the kind that assumed her presence was an error, a glitch in the system. "I'm not moving," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "This is my seat, paid for and confirmed. If there's a mistake, it's not mine." Margaret's smirk vanished, replaced by a thin, furious line. Her assistant shifted uncomfortably, whispering, "Maybe we should check with the staff, Margaret?" But Margaret ignored her, leaning closer, her perfume a sharp cloud of jasmine. "You don't belong here," she hissed, low enough that only Nia could hear. "People like you don't get seats like this." The words landed like a slap, raw and deliberate, but Nia didn't blink. She'd faced worse, from sneering professors who doubted her intellect to executives who questioned her right to lead. She leaned back, crossing her legs, and fixed Margaret with a steady gaze. "People like me?" she repeated, her voice soft but laced with steel. "You mean the ones who earned their way here? Take it up with the conductor if you're confused." Margaret straightened, her cheeks flushing a faint pink. But before she could fire back, the conductor appeared, drawn by the rising tension like a moth to a flame. Paul was a wiry man in his late 40s, his Silver Line uniform slightly wrinkled, his thinning brown hair combed over a sweaty scalp. His eyes flicked between Nia and Margaret, landing on the latter with a flicker of recognition. "Is there a problem here, ladies?" he asked, his voice high and nervous, hands clasped in front of him. Margaret spun on him, her coat swirling. "Yes, there's a problem," she snapped, gesturing at Nia. "This woman is in my seat. I'm a platinum member and I expect priority. Fix this now." Paul's gaze darted to Nia, then back to Margaret, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "Ma'am," he said to Nia, his tone apologetic but shaky. "Could I see your ticket?" Nia handed it over without a word, her movements deliberate, her eyes never leaving his face. Paul scanned it, his fingers trembling slightly as he traced the printed details. "It, looks valid," he muttered, almost to himself. Margaret huffed, crossing her arms. "That's impossible," she said. "I always get 1A. She must have pulled some last-minute trick. I deserve this seat, Paul. You know me." Paul flinched at the use of his name, clearly familiar with Margaret's tantrums. He turned back to Nia, his voice dropping to a pleading whisper. "Miss, I'm sorry, but could you maybe move to another seat? Just to keep things smooth? She's a regular, and well, it's policy to prioritize frequent riders." Nia's eyes narrowed, a spark of anger flashing beneath her calm exterior. "Policy?" she said, her voice rising just enough to carry. "My ticket says 1A. I paid full price months in advance. If your policy screws over paying customers, that's your mess, not mine." Paul shrank back, his face paling, but Margaret stepped forward, her voice booming now. "This is ridiculous. Do you know who I am? I'll have your job for this. Paul, get her out of here." The assistant tugged at Margaret's sleeve, murmuring, "Let's not escalate." But Margaret shook her off, her glare fixed on Nia. Paul hesitated, caught in the crossfire, then made his choice. He straightened, forcing authority into his voice. "Miss, I'm going to need you to come with me," he said to Nia. "We'll sort this out off the train." Nia stared at him, disbelief warring with fury, but she didn't budge. "I'm not leaving my seat," she said, each word a brick in a wall. "You want me gone, you'll have to drag me." Paul's lips pressed into a thin line, and he waved a hand toward the back of the car. Two security guards, broad-shouldered men in black uniforms, lumbered forward, their boots thudding against the carpet. The taller guard, a guy with a buzz, cut and a scar across his cheek, grabbed Nia's arm. "Let's go, lady," he grunted, pulling her up. She didn't scream, didn't flail, just stood with a dignity that made the scene uglier. The second guard snatched her satchel, tossing it toward the exit. Passengers craned their necks, some whispering, others filming with their phones. "About time," one man muttered, his voice thick with approval. "She's holding up the whole train," a woman added, her tone sharp. Margaret smirked, sliding into 1A as Nia was hauled toward the door, her heels scraping the floor. The guards shoved Nia onto the platform, the cold air hitting her like a slap. Paul followed, wringing his hands. "Sorry about this," he mumbled, avoiding her eyes. "It's just easier this way." The taller guard leaned in, his breath sour as he sneered. "Know your place next time." Nia stumbled as they released her, catching herself against a bench. Her satchel landed at her feet, papers spilling across the concrete. The train's doors hissed shut behind her, and through the window, she saw Margaret adjusting her coat, victorious. The engine roared, and the silver line pulled away, leaving Nia alone in the fading light. She stood there, chest heaving, the weight of the insult sinking in. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about every time she'd been dismissed, every sidelong glance that said she didn't belong. Her conference loomed in New York, her company's future riding on it, and now she was stranded, her pride battered. But Nia wasn't done. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her fingers steady despite the tremor in her heart. She had one call to make, and it would change everything. As the train's taillights vanished into the dusk, she dialed Victor, her voice low and lethal. "You won't believe what just happened." Nia Jackson stood on the deserted Chicago platform, the chill of the late afternoon biting through her navy suit as the Silver Line's taillights faded into a pinprick against the horizon. Her satchel lay sprawled at her feet, papers fluttering, in the wind like wounded birds. The sting of Margaret Voss's smirk lingered, a venomous aftertaste, but Nia's hands didn't shake as she pulled her phone from her pocket. Her breath fogged in the crisp air, her eyes blazing with a fury she kept tightly leashed. She'd been humiliated, dragged off like a criminal, but this wasn't the end, not by a long shot. She scrolled to Victor's name, her mentor, and a Silver Line board member, and hit call. The line clicked after one ring. "Nia?" Victor's voice crackled through, deep and steady, a lifeline in the storm. "What's wrong? You sound off." She took a breath, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a rage she could barely contain. "Victor, they just threw me off the train," she said, her words sharp as glass. "Some platinum-tier white woman, Margaret Voss, claimed my seat, 1A. I showed my ticket, proved it was mine, but the conductor, Paul, wouldn't listen. He called security and they hauled me out, said I didn't belong there." Victor sucked in a breath, the sound harsh over the line. "They did what?" he snapped, his tone shifting from concern to disbelief. "You're kidding me. You paid for that seat. They can't just—" "They did," Nia cut in, pacing the platform, her heels clicking against the concrete. "Margaret said I didn't belong, and Paul folded like a cheap chair. Security told me to know my place. I'm stranded, Victor. My conference is tomorrow and I'm stuck here because of her." Her voice cracked on the last word, the weight of it all pressing down. Victor went silent for a beat, then his tone hardened, a steel edge she knew meant business. "Stay where you are," he said. "I'm on the board. I'll handle this. Give me 10 minutes. The call ended with a click, leaving Nia staring at the screen, her pulse hammering in. Her ears. She sank onto a bench, the cold metal biting into her thighs, and watched the station clock tick forward. The platform was eerily quiet now, travelers gone, the air thick with the scent of diesel and damp stone. Her mind replayed the scene. Margaret's sneer, Paul's nervous stammer, the guard's cruel jab. It wasn't just a seat, it was her dignity, her right to exist in a space she'd earned. 7 minutes later, her phone buzzed. Victor again. "It's done," he said, his voice clipped with satisfaction. "Paul and his crew are fired. Corporate caught wind, halted the train 5 miles out. They're offloading the staff now. You've got justice, Nia." She stood, a flicker of triumph warming her chest as she pictured Paul's sweaty face crumpling. "Good," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her eyes. "They deserve it." Through the station's glass wall, she saw a sleek replacement. Train glide into view, its silver cars gleaming under the floodlights. Victor chuckled. "More good news. They're sending a new ride for you. VIP car's yours, no questions. Get to New York and kill that conference." Nia nodded, grabbing her satchel. "Thanks, Victor. I owe you." He laughed, low and warm. "You owe me nothing. Just keep winning." She boarded the new train, her steps lighter now, and found 1A waiting, its leather seat pristine, the window offering a view of the darkening skyline. The car was half empty, a few passengers glancing her way with mild curiosity, but no hostility this time. She settled in, smoothing her suit, and let out a long breath. Justice tasted sweet, a fleeting victory after the sting of humiliation. She could almost hear Margaret's indignant huff as Paul and his team were marched off, their careers torched with one call. Nia leaned back, closing her eyes, imagining the chaos unfolding miles away. She'd won this round. The train hummed, to life, pulling out with a smooth jolt, and she felt the tension in her shoulders ease. New York beckoned, her deal within reach. But then, through the window, she caught a glimpse of the first train, stalled on a parallel track. Margaret Voss stood at the glass, her cream coat stark against the dim interior. Her lips curled into a smirk that sent a chill down Nia's spine. The woman wasn't shaken, wasn't defeated. She looked smug, triumphant even, as if she'd already planned her next move. Nia's stomach twisted, the sweetness of her win souring fast. Margaret hadn't been touched by the firings. She was still aboard, still in control. The new conductor, a stocky man with a buzzed head, passed by Nia's seat, his eyes lingering on her for a beat too long. He leaned down, his voice a gruff whisper. "Don't get too comfortable," he said, nodding toward Margaret's distant figure. "We'll fix this." Nia's heart thudded, her victory unraveling in an instant. She gripped the armrest, her knuckles whitening. Margaret wasn't done. This wasn't over. The train picked up speed, the city lights blurring into streaks, but Nia's mind raced faster. What had Victor missed? How deep did Margaret's influence run? She'd thought one call would end it, that justice would stick, but that smirk told her otherwise. Margaret had strings to pull, and Nia was still in her crosshairs. The conference loomed, her company's future hanging by a thread, and now she was on a collision course with a woman who wouldn't let a firing stop her. Nia straightened, her jaw setting. She'd fight back, but the chill in her gut whispered a warning. The next blow would be worse. "Hey, you're in the thick of this wild ride now. What do you think? Did Nia deserve that quick win, or was Margaret's smugness a gut punch you saw coming? Drop a number 1 in the comments if you're cheering for Nia to crush it, or a number 2 if you think Margaret's got more venom up her sleeve. Hit that like button if you're hooked on this fight for justice, and subscribe to catch every twist. We're just getting started. Ever wonder how far someone will, go to protect their privilege? Nia's about to find out. What's Margaret cooking up next? Nia Jackson sank into the plush leather of seat 1A on the replacement Silver Line train. The hum of the engine a steady pulse beneath her feet as Chicago's skyline faded into the dusk. Her navy suit was slightly rumpled now, a faint crease, marking where the security guard had gripped her arm, but she smoothed it with a deliberate hand, reclaiming her composure. The VIP car was quieter than the last, its handful of passengers absorbed in their own worlds. A man in a pinstripe suit tapping at a laptop, a woman sipping wine with her eyes closed. Nia's satchel rested on her lap, her fingers tracing its edges as she replayed Victor's words. The staff fired, justice served. She let herself relax, just a fraction, the tension in her shoulders unwinding as the train sliced through the night toward New York. Her conference keynote loomed, a lifeline for her biotech empire, and she was back on track, or so she thought. The new conductor, Hank, lumbered into the car 20 minutes later, his bulk filling the aisle. He was a broad man, maybe 6'3", with a buzzed head and a jaw like a slab of granite. His Silver Line uniform strained at the shoulders, his badge glinting under the dim overhead lights. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait, his boots thudding against the carpet, and Nia caught the faint scent of tobacco as he approached. His eyes locked onto her, dark and unreadable, lingering longer than necessary. She straightened, a prickle of unease crawling up her spine, but she kept her face neutral, meeting his gaze. "Evening," she said, her voice calm, testing the waters. Hank didn't smile. He stopped beside her seat, one meaty hand resting on the back of the chair across the aisle, his fingers curling into the leather. "Ticket," he said, his voice a low growl, more command than request. Nia's brow furrowed, but she reached into her satchel, pulling out the crisp slip of paper. "Here," she said, handing it over, her tone steady despite the sudden tightness in her chest. Hank took it, his thick fingers dwarfing the ticket as he held it up to the light, squinting at the print. He turned it over, then back, his silence stretching into something heavy, deliberate. The other passengers glanced up, curiosity flickering in their eyes, but no one spoke. "This ain't right," Hank said finally, his words dropping like stones. Nia blinked, her pulse quickening. "What's not right?" she asked, keeping her voice even, though a spark of anger flared beneath it. Hank's lips twitched, not quite a smirk, but close enough to make her skin crawl. "This ticket," he said, tapping it with a stubby finger. "Looks forged to me. Got a call saying someone flagged you. Name's Jackson, right? Nia Jackson?" Her stomach lurched, the air in the car thickening as heads turned fully now, eyes boring into her. "That's my name," she said, her tone sharpening. "And that ticket's real. I booked it months ago. Check your system." Hank didn't move, didn't reach for his tablet or radio. He just stood there, towering over her, his shadow swallowing the light from the window. "System's down," he lied, his voice flat. "But I got orders. Someone reported you for fraud, said you pulled a fast one to get this seat." Nia's mind raced, snapping back to Margaret Voss's smirk through the stalled train's window, the conductor's whispered promise. "We'll fix this." This wasn't random. This was Margaret, striking back, her influence snaking through the Silver Line's veins. "That's nonsense," Nia said, her voice rising now, cutting through the hush. "I've got proof. My confirmation email, my payment records. Look at them." She pulled her phone from her pocket, scrolling to the Email with a flick of her thumb, but Hank waved a hand, dismissing it before she could turn the screen. "Don't matter," he said, his tone gruff, final. "I'm confiscating this." He snatched the ticket from her fingers, crumpling it in his fist, then reached down and yanked her ID from her satchel's open flap. Nia lunged to grab it. Back, but he stepped out of reach, holding it up like a trophy. "Hey," she snapped, standing now, her 5'7" frame dwarfed by his bulk but her presence filling the car. "That's mine. You've got no right." "I've got every right," Hank shot back, his voice booming now, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "You're a problem passenger. Gotta tip your trouble. I'm taking this ID, and if you don't sit down, I'll have you in cuffs before we hit the next stop." The man in the pinstripe suit looked up from his laptop, his lips pursing in disapproval. "She's holding us up again," he muttered, loud enough for Nia to hear. The woman with the wine opened her eyes, sneering. "Typical," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "Always making a scene." Nia's chest tightened, the weight of their stares pressing in, a chorus of judgment she'd faced too many times before. "This is insane," Nia said, turning back to Hank, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "I paid for this seat. I was dragged off the last train because of your staff's screw-up, and now you're accusing me of fraud? Call your supervisor. Check my records. Do your job." Hank's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something dark passing through them, anger, or maybe amusement. "I don't need to check nothing," he said. "You're flagged. That's enough for me. Now, sit, or you're off this train too." He leaned in, his breath hot against her ear as he dropped his voice. "And if you push me, I'll make sure the cops are waiting. Fraud's a felony, lady." Nia froze, her mind spinning as the pieces clicked into place. Margaret hadn't just sulked after the firings. She'd called ahead, planted lies, turned Nia's name into a target. This wasn't about a seat anymore. It was about erasing her, painting her as a criminal to anyone who'd listen. She sat, not because she was giving up, but because she needed time to think. Hank smirked, tucking her ID into his pocket, the crumpled ticket still in his fist. "Good choice," he said, turning away, his boots thudding back down the aisle. The other passengers relaxed, their whispers fading into the hum of the train, but Nia felt their eyes lingering, a mix of suspicion and contempt. She stared out. The window, the dark fields blurring past, her reflection sharp against the glass. Her conference was hours away, her deal hanging by a thread, and now she was defenseless, her ID gone, her name smeared. She could call Victor again, but what if Margaret's reach went higher? The conductor's words gnawed at her. Flagged, fraud, felony. This was a setup, a trap tightening around her with every mile. She pulled her phone out, her fingers hovering over the screen. But before she could dial, Hank's voice crackled over the intercom, sharp and deliberate. "Next stop, Springfield," he said, pausing for effect. "Got a passenger needs detaining. Authorities''ll handle it." Nia's blood ran cold, her grip tightening on the phone. Detaining. Authorities. He wasn't bluffing. He'd radioed ahead, setting her up for something worse than a lost seat. She glanced around the car, the passengers oblivious or complicit, their silence a wall she couldn't break. Margaret's revenge wasn't subtle anymore. It was a sledgehammer, and Nia was the target. Her victory from the phone call felt like a lifetime ago, a fleeting spark snuffed out by this new nightmare. She had to move, had to fight, but the train barreled on, the clock ticking down to Springfield where handcuffs and lies waited. Margaret's smirk flashed in her mind, a promise of more to come, and Nia knew this was just the beginning. The Silver Line train barreled through the Illinois night, its wheels screaming against the tracks as Nia Jackson sat rigid in seat 1A, her phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline. The VIP car's dim lights cast long shadows across the polished wood, the hum of the engine a relentless drumbeat under her feet. Her navy suit was creased now, her blouse damp with sweat from the confrontation with Hank, the conductor who'd branded her a fraud. His words echoed in her skull. "Authorities''ll handle it." Springfield loomed minutes away, a trap tightening with every mile. She stared out the window, the dark fields a blur of black and gray, her reflection a ghost against the glass. Her ID was gone, her ticket confiscated, and her name flagged as a criminal, all because Margaret Voss wouldn't let a fired staff be the end of it. The intercom crackled again, Hank's voice slicing through the quiet. "Springfield 2 minutes," he said, his tone clipped, smug. Nia's pulse spiked, her mind racing for an escape. She couldn't call Victor yet, the signal was spotty, and she needed a plan before the cops he'd promised were waiting stepped aboard. The other passengers avoided her gaze, the man in the pinstripe suit typing furiously. The wine-sipping woman now dozing with her glass tipped precariously. They'd already judged her, their earlier sneers branding her a troublemaker. She was alone, cornered, but Nia hadn't built a biotech empire by folding under pressure. She slipped her phone into her pocket, her eyes scanning the car for anything she could use. The train slowed, brakes squealing as Springfield's lights flickered into view. A small station glowing against the night. Nia stood, her legs steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins, and moved toward the exit, her satchel slung over her shoulder. She'd face whatever was coming head-on, prove her innocence with the evidence still on her phone. But as the doors hissed open, 2 cops stormed aboard, their boots pounding the carpet with military precision. They were big men, both white, their uniforms crisp, badges gleaming under the car's lights. The taller one had a shaved head and a scar snaking down his neck. The shorter one's eyes were cold, his hand resting on his holster. Nia froze, her breath catching as they zeroed in on her. "Nia Jackson?" the tall one barked, his voice a gravelly snarl. She nodded, her chin lifting defiantly. "That's me," she said, her tone calm but edged with steel. "What's this about?" The shorter cop stepped forward, his lips curling into a sneer. "You're under arrest," he said, pulling handcuffs from his belt. "Fugitive warrant, fake ID, fraud, the works. Hands behind your back." Nia's stomach dropped, her mind snapping to Margaret's husband, a sheriff with enough pull to twist the law into a weapon. "That's a lie," she said, stepping back, her voice rising. "I've got proof my ticket was real. This is harassment." "Tell it to the judge," the tall cop snapped, lunging for her arm. She twisted away, but the shorter one grabbed her wrist, yanking it behind her with a force that made her gasp. The cuffs clicked shut, cold metal biting into her skin, and the passengers erupted into murmurs. "Finally," the pinstripe man muttered, his voice thick with relief. "Get her out of here," the wine woman slurred, waking just enough to glare. Nia's chest burned, the injustice searing through her as the cops dragged her toward the door, her heels scraping the floor. They hauled her onto the platform, the night air sharp against her face, and shoved her toward a waiting squad car parked under a flickering street lamp. Springfield Station was a squat brick building, its windows dark, the lot empty except for a few stray cars. Nia stumbled, catching herself as the tall cop pushed her forward. "Move it," he growled, his hand clamped on her shoulder. She twisted her head, meeting his gaze. "You've got no evidence," she said, her voice steady despite the ache in her wrists. "This is illegal. I want your names." The shorter cop laughed, a harsh barking sound. "You don't call the shots, sweetheart," he said, slamming the car door open. "Sheriff Voss says you're a runner. We're just doing our job." Voss, Margaret's husband. Nia's blood ran cold, the name a confirmation of the nightmare she'd suspected. This wasn't a random bust. It was a calculated hit, a retaliation for the firing she'd triggered with Victor's call. They shoved her into the back seat, the vinyl sticky against her suit, and slammed the door. The tall cop slid behind the wheel, the shorter one riding shotgun, and the car peeled out, tires squealing as they sped toward a gray cinder block building on the town's edge. Nia's mind raced, piecing it together. Margaret had called her husband, spun a lie, and now she was trapped. Her conference slipping away, her company's future dangling by a thread. The station was a grim box, its fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as they dragged her inside. The air stank of stale coffee and mildew, the walls scuffed with years of neglect. They pushed her into a holding cell, a 6x8 cage with a rusted bench and a cracked concrete floor. The tall cop uncuffed her, tossing her satchel into the corner, its contents spilling out. Pens, a notebook, her phone. "Sit tight," he said, smirking as he locked the door. "You're not going anywhere." Nia rubbed her wrists, the red mark stark against her skin, and met his gaze through the bars. "This won't hold," she said, her voice low, lethal. "You're making a mistake," the shorter cop snorted, leaning against the wall. "Mistake's yours," he said, crossing his arms. "Should have given up that seat when you had the chance." He turned to leave, but the tall one lingered, slipping a folded note through the bars. It fluttered to the floor, and Nia scooped it up, her fingers trembling as she unfolded it. Scrawled in jagged ink were the words, "Margaret says this is just the start." Her heart thudded, a sickening lurch as the cop's footsteps faded down the hall, the door slamming shut behind them. She was alone, locked in a cell, the weight of Margaret's vengeance crashing down. Nia sank onto the bench, the note crumpled. In her fist, her mind spinning. This wasn't just about humiliation anymore, it was about destruction. Margaret's husband had turned her into a fugitive, a smear on her name that could tank her company, her deal, her life. She pulled her phone from the satchel, the screen cracked but glowing, and dialed Victor, her breath shallow as it rang. "Nia?" he answered, his voice tight with worry. "Where are you? The train said you boarded." She swallowed, forcing calm into her words. "Springfield jail," she said. "Cops arrested me. Margaret's husband set it up, fake warrant. Fraud charges. I'm locked up, Victor." "What?" Victor's shout rattled the line, his shock morphing into fury. "They can't do that, I'll get you out. Lawyers, calls, whatever it takes. Hold on." Nia nodded, though he couldn't see, her eyes fixed on the note. "Hurry," she said, her voice dropping. "They're not stopping here." The call cut out, static buzzing in her ear as she leaned back against the wall, the cold seeping through her suit. She'd thought the firings were a win, a clean break, but Margaret had turned it into a war. The cell door loomed, a steel barrier between her and New York, her keynote now a distant dream. She clutched the phone, her only weapon, and waited, knowing the next move would be uglier, deadlier, a storm she'd have to outrun. Nia Jackson sat on the rusted bench in the Springfield jail cell, the cracked concrete floor cold beneath her feet, her navy suit now streaked with dust from the scuffle with the cops. The holding cell's fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow across the cinder block walls, the air thick with the stench of mildew and despair. Her satchel lay in the corner, its contents scattered, her cracked phone glowing faintly in her hand. "The note from the tall cop," Margaret says. "This is just the start," was crumpled in her fist, a venomous promise that fueled the fire in her chest. She'd called Victor, her lifeline, and he'd promised lawyers, rescue, but the clock was ticking. Her conference in New York was hours away, her biotech empire teetering, and Margaret Voss's husband had locked her in this cage to watch it all burn. Footsteps echoed down the hall, heavy and deliberate, snapping Nia out of her thoughts. She stood, her legs stiff but steady, and slipped the phone into her pocket, her eyes narrowing as a shadow loomed beyond the bars. It was the tall cop, his scarred neck glinting under the light, a smirk twisting his lips. He carried a baton now, tapping it against his palm with a slow, menacing rhythm. "Time's up," he said, his voice a low growl. "Sheriff Voss wants you processed. No lawyers coming, lady. You're ours now." Nia's pulse spiked, but she kept her face a mask, her mind racing. Processed. That meant deeper into the system, a place where Margaret's reach could bury her for good. "Where's my call?" she asked, stepping closer to the bars, her voice sharp, unwavering. "I've got rights." The cop laughed, a harsh, grating sound that bounced off the walls. "Rights?" he said, leaning in, his breath sour with coffee. "You lost those when you crossed the wrong people. Sheriff says you're a flight risk. No calls, no nothing." He twirled the baton, his eyes glinting with something dark, predatory. Nia's stomach twisted, but she didn't flinch. She'd faced down worse, executives who'd sneered at her pitches, investors who'd doubted her worth. This was just another bully, and she wasn't breaking. She glanced past him, scanning the hall. Empty. No cameras, just a flickering bulb casting jagged shadows. Her eyes dropped to the lock on the cell door, a simple pin and tumbler design, rusted but functional. An idea sparked, quick and desperate. She'd picked locks as a kid, a trick learned from her brother to escape their cramped apartment when their mom worked late. Her hairpin, a slim silver clip holding her braids, was still tucked into her hair. She met the cop's gaze, forcing a faint smile. "Fine," she said, stepping back, her tone softening. "Process me, but you'll regret this." He snorted, turning to radio his partner, his back to her for a fleeting second. Naya moved fast, her fingers slipping the pin from her hair, bending it into a crude pick. She knelt by the lock, her hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins, and worked the tumblers, feeling them click one by one. The cop's voice droned into the radio. "Yeah, she's ready, bring the van." The lock popped, a soft snick drowned by his words, and Nia held her breath, easing the door open an inch. He turned back, eyes narrowing, but she was already moving, slamming the door into his face with a force that sent him staggering. His baton clattered to the floor, and she bolted, snatching her satchel as she ran. The hall stretched ahead, a dim tunnel of peeling paint and locked doors, but she spotted an exit sign glowing red at the far end. Footsteps thundered behind her, the cop roaring, "Stop her!" She burst through the exit into the night, the cold air hitting her like a wave, the squad car still parked in the lot. She ducked behind it, her chest heaving, and scanned the street. A truck idled 50 yards away, its driver, a wiry man in a flannel shirt, climbing out to check his tires. Naya sprinted toward him, her heels pounding the asphalt, and waved her arms. "Help me," she called, her voice raw. "I need a ride, please." The man, mid-40s with a scruffy beard, squinted at her, then nodded. "Hop in," he said, his tone gruff but kind. "Where you headed?" Naya climbed into the cab, the smell of oil and leather washing over her. "Anywhere but here," she said. Slamming the doors, the cop stumbled out of the station, shouting into his radio. The trucker gunned the engine, peeling out onto the highway, Springfield shrinking in the side mirror. Nia exhaled, her body trembling now, the rush of escape flooding her with relief. "Thanks," she said, glancing at him. "You saved me." He shrugged, eyes on the road. "Looked like you needed it. Name's Tom." She nodded, pulling her phone from her satchel, the cracked screen flickering as she dialed Victor. "Naya?" He answered, his voice tight with panic. "Where are you? The lawyer's on his way." She leaned back, the truck's rumble vibrating through her. "I broke out," she said, her breath steadying. "Cops were dirty, Victor. Margaret's husband's men. I'm with a trucker heading east." Victor cursed, low and fierce. "You're kidding. I'll track you, get you safe. But listen, Sheriff." Voss just went bigger. "Statewide alert calling you a dangerous fugitive. Your face is on every news screen." Nia's heart sank, her eyes flicking to the truck's dashboard where a small TV flickered with a grainy broadcast. There she was, her company headshot plastered across the screen, the ticker screaming, "Fugitive Nia Jackson, wanted for fraud and assault." Her stomach churned, the weight of it crashing down. Her conference deal, her company's stock, everything she'd built was unraveling. "They're destroying me," she whispered, her voice breaking for the first time. Victor's tone hardened. "Not if I can help it. Stay low, Nia. I'll fix this." The call ended, leaving her staring at the screen, her name a curse in bold red letters. She turned to Tom, forcing calm into her words. "Can you get me to New York?" He nodded, adjusting his cap. "Long haul, but sure. You in trouble?" She managed a faint smile, her mind spinning. "More than you know." The truck rolled on, the highway stretching into the dark, and for a moment she thought she'd outrun it. The cell, the cops, Margaret's grip. But then Tom's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, his brow furrowing. Lady," he said, his voice tightening. "We've got company." Nia twisted, peering through the back window. A black SUV roared up behind them, its headlights blinding, closing fast. Her breath caught, panic clawing at her throat. "Speed up," she said, her voice urgent. Tom floored it, the truck lurching forward, but the SUV gained, its engine a predatory growl. Nia's phone buzzed, Victor again, but before she could answer, Tom's hand shot to the glove box, pulling out a wad of cash. "Reward," he muttered, his tone shifting, cold now. "Sorry, lady. You're worth 10 grand. He slammed the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop, and locked the doors with a click, trapping her inside. The SUV screeched up beside them. 2 men in dark jackets leaping out, guns glinting in the moonlight. Nia's heart pounded, her escape shattered as Tom turned on her, lured by Margaret's bounty. She was caught, the hunter's net tightening, and New York felt a million miles away. Whoa, talk about a nail-biter. What do you think? Did Nia's breakout guts blow you away, or did Tom's betrayal hit you like a freight train? Drop a number. 1 in the comments if you're rooting for Nia to outsmart these snakes, or a number 2 if you think Margaret's got her cornered. Smash that like button if you're loving this roller coaster, and subscribe to see Nia fight back. We're not done yet. Ever wonder how far greed can twist a stranger's heart? What's Tom about to unleash on her next? Nia Jackson sat trapped in the cab of Tom's truck, the locked doors a steel cage around her as the black SUV screeched to a halt beside them on the dark Illinois highway. Her navy suit clung to her skin, damp with sweat, her cracked phone buzzing, unanswered in her lap. Victor trying to reach her. The truck's engine growled low, the dashboard casting a faint green glow across Tom's face, his scruffy beard and flannel shirt now menacing in the shadows. He'd saved her from the Springfield jail, driven her miles toward freedom, only to flip for a 10 grand reward dangled by Margaret Voss's network. The 2 men from the SUV, clad in dark jackets, pounded on the cab's window, their guns glinting in the moonlight. But Tom held the lock firm, his eyes cold as he stared at Nia. Nothing personal, he said, his voice a gravelly drawl. Just business. Nia's heart slammed against her ribs, her mind racing for an out. You don't have to do this, she said, her tone steady despite the panic clawing at her throat. Let me go, and I'll pay you double. Cash, no questions. Tom's lips twitched, a flicker of doubt crossing his face, but he shook his head, clutching the wad of bills from the glove box. Too late, he muttered, unlocking the passenger door with a flick of his wrist. The men outside yanked it open, their hands rough as they grabbed Nia's arms, dragging her out onto the asphalt. She kicked, her heels scraping the ground, but their grip was iron, bruising her skin through her suit. The taller man, a wiry figure with a shaved head, slammed her against the truck's side, the metal cold and unforgiving against her back. Sheriff Voss sends his regards, he snarled, his breath hot with tobacco. The shorter one, stocky with a patchy beard, holstered his gun and pulled out a pair of cuffs, snapping them onto her wrists with a vicious twist. Nia winced, the steel cutting into her flesh, but she didn't cry out. She'd faced Margaret's husband's cops before, escaped their cell, and she'd survived this too. You're wasting your time, she said, her voice low, lethal. This won't stick. The tall one laughed, a sharp, ugly sound, and shoved her toward a dirt road branching off the highway, the SUV's headlights carving a path into the dark. They drove her 5 miles to a rural sheriff's outpost, a squat wooden shack surrounded by scraggly pines, its windows boarded, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and gasoline. Inside, Deputy Roy waited, a hulking man in his 50s with a buzz cut and a badge pinned crookedly to his khaki uniform. His face was ruddy, his eyes small and mean, and he grinned as the men pushed Nia through the door, her satchel slung over the stocky one's shoulder. Well, well, Roy said, his voice a slow, syrupy drawl. Margaret's little problem. Cousin said you'd be a handful. Nia straightened, her chin lifting despite the ache in her arms. Your cousin's a coward, she said, meeting his gaze. Hiding behind badges and lies, Roy's grin vanished, his hand lashing out to crack across her face, the blow snapping her head to the side. Pain exploded in her cheek, a hot sting that blurred her vision, but she bit back a gasp, tasting blood where her lip split. Watch. Your mouth, he spat, stepping closer, his bulk towering over her 5'7" frame. You're nothing here, girl. Nobody's coming for you. He grabbed her by the collar, dragging her across the room to a wooden chair bolted to the floor, and shoved her down, his meaty hands chaining her wrists to the armrests. The cuffs bit deeper, blood trickling warm against her skin, but Nia's eyes burned with defiance, locking onto his. He circled her, his boots thudding against the warped floorboards, his voice dripping with venom. "Think you're smart, huh? Getting Paul fired, running from my boys? You're just a nobody who got lucky." He leaned in, his face inches from hers, his breath rank with whiskey. "Ain't nobody gonna miss you when we're done." Nia's stomach churned, but she forced a faint smile, her voice steady despite the throbbing in her jaw. "You're wrong," she said. "People know where I am. You touch me, and you're finished." Roy's eyes narrowed, a flicker of unease, breaking his swagger, but he masked it with a sneer, slamming his fist into her ribs. The air rushed from her lungs, pain searing through her side, and she doubled over as far as the chains allowed, her vision swimming. "Liar," Roy hissed, hitting her again, this time in the shoulder, the crack of bone against bone echoing in the shack. Nia clenched her teeth, swallowing a cry, her mind racing through the haze. She had to hold on, had to outlast him until Victor's lawyer arrived. Her satchel lay in the corner, her phone inside, a lifeline if she could reach it. Roy stepped back, cracking his knuckles, his grin returning. "Gonna be a long night," he said, turning to grab a length of rope from a shelf. Nia seized the moment, her fingers fumbling with the hairpin still tucked in her braids, a spare she'd kept after the jailbreak. She worked it into the cuff's lock, her hands trembling but precise, the tumblers clicking as Roy rummaged through a toolbox, muttering slurs under his breath. Uppity. Trash. Words she'd heard 1,000 times and turned into fuel. The cuff popped open, then the other, and she lunged for her satchel, snatching her phone as Roy spun around, roaring, "What the hell?" She dialed Victor, her thumb slamming the call button, and bolted for the door, his footsteps thundering. Behind her. "Victor!" she shouted as the line connected, ducking Roy's swinging arm. "I'm at an outpost, Voss's cousin. Help me!" Victor's voice crackled through, frantic. "Nia, hold on. Lawyer's 10 minutes out. I've got cops, clean ones, on the way." She burst outside, the night air sharp against her battered face, and sprinted toward the trees, Roy's curses echoing behind her. Branches clawed at her suit, her ribs screaming with every step, but she kept moving, the phone pressed to her ear. "He's got me chained," she lied, panting, buying time as Victor shouted orders on the other end. Headlights flashed in the distance, a sleek sedan tearing down the dirt road, her rescue. The car screeched to a stop, a wiry man in a gray suit leaping out, badge gleaming, Victor's lawyer flanked by 2 state troopers. Roy froze mid-chase, his face paling as the troopers drew their guns, shouting, "Hands up!" Nia stumbled to the sedan, collapsing against it, her breath ragged, blood dripping from her lip. The lawyer caught her, his voice calm. "You're safe now. We've got him." Roy was cuffed, snarling as they dragged him away, but Nia's relief was short-lived. Her phone buzzed, a news alert flashing. Biotech innovation stock plummets amid CEO fugitive scandal. Her company, her life's work, was crumbling. Margaret's revenge cutting deeper than Roy's fists. She sank into the sedan, the lawyer, slamming the door as the troopers hauled Roy off. Victor's voice buzzed through the speaker. "Nia, you're clear, but the damage, your stock's tanking. We'll fight it." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the shack as they pulled away. Roy's glare burning through the dark. She'd escaped, survived, but at what cost? Her conference slot was slipping, her empire fracturing, and Margaret wasn't done. As the car sped toward safety, Nia glanced at her satchel, her keynote notes intact, until the lawyer frowned, peering out the back window. "He torched something," he said, pointing to a flicker of flame. Nia's gut sank. Roy had burned her briefcase, her notes reduced to ash, leaving her with nothing for New York but bruises and a fight she couldn't yet win. Nia Jackson slumped in the backseat of the lawyer's sedan, the hum of the engine a dull roar beneath her as they sped away from the rural sheriff's outpost. Her navy suit hung in tatters, stained with dirt and blood, her lips swollen and her ribs aching from Deputy Roy's blows. The night pressed against the windows, a starless void swallowing the pines, but the flicker of flames in the rearview mirror lingered in her mind. Her briefcase, her keynote notes, reduced to ash by Roy's final act of spite. Her cracked phone rested in her lap, the screen glowing with the news alert. Biotech innovation stock plummets amid CEO fugitive scandal. Her company was bleeding out, her conference slot in New York slipping away. All because Margaret Voss had turned a seat dispute into a war. But Nia wasn't broken. Not yet. The lawyer, a wiry man named Ellis with sharp eyes and a gray suit, glanced at her from the driver's seat. "You're safe now," he said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "Victor's got the state troopers locking down Roy. We'll get you to a motel, clean you up." Nia nodded, her jaw tight, the pain in her side a constant pulse. "I need a charger," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. "And Wi-Fi. This isn't over." Ellis raised an eyebrow but didn't argue, pulling into a roadside motel 30 miles east, its neon sign buzzing vacancy in flickering red. The lot was near empty, just a pickup truck and a rusted sedan parked under a sagging awning. Inside, the room was a drab box, faded floral wallpaper, a lumpy bed, a chipped desk. Nia sank onto the mattress, wincing as her ribs protested, while Ellis plugged her phone into a charger he'd dug from his briefcase. The screen flared to life, notifications piling up. Victor's missed calls, emails from her team, more headlines, screaming her name. She opened X, her fingers trembling but precise, and started typing, her words a raw, unfiltered blaze. "I'm Nia Jackson, CEO of Biotech Innovations. Today, Margaret Voss, a Silverline Platinum member, had me dragged off a train, beaten and framed because I wouldn't give up my seat. This is racism, plain and simple. I won't be silenced." She attached a photo of her bruised face, her split lips stark against her skin, and hit post. The tweet exploded, retweets and likes surging within minutes. Hashtags like Justice for Nia and Silverline Racism trending as her followers, scientists, activists, everyday people, amplified her voice. Comments flooded in. "This is disgusting. Stand strong, Nia, and Silverline's done for." She leaned back, her breath shallow, watching the numbers climb. Ellis paced by the window, peering through the blinds. "You're lighting a fire," he said, his tone a mix of awe and caution. "People are pissed." Nia managed a faint smile, the pain in her cheek flaring. "Good," she said. "Let them be." Her phone buzzed. "Victor." She answered, putting it on speaker as Ellis hovered nearby. "Nia, you're viral," Victor said, his voice crackling with energy. "Protests are popping up outside Silverline's HQ in Chicago. People want answers. Margaret's name's everywhere." Nia's chest tightened, a flicker of hope cutting through the exhaustion. "Can we use this?" she asked, her mind already spinning. "Pressure them to back off?" Victor chuckled, sharp and fierce. "Already on it. I'm pushing the board. New policies, investigations. You're turning the tide." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the screen as the protest photos rolled in. Signs reading "No more Voss privilege." Crowds chanting her name. For a moment, she thought she'd won. That public outrage would shield her, force Margaret to retreat. Her stock might stabilize, her conference slot might hold. She stood, ignoring the stab in her ribs, and limped to the desk, pulling up her company's site on Ellis's laptop. The numbers were grim, shares down 30%, but the X storm was shifting the narrative. She typed a follow-up. "Thank you for standing with me. This fight's bigger than a seat. It's about dignity." The post surged again, her supporters roaring louder, a wave she could ride to New York. But then the tide turned. Her phone pinged with a new alert, a video link from a local news station. She clicked it, her breath catching as Margaret Voss's husband, Sheriff Voss, filled the screen. His khaki uniform crisp, his face stern but calculated. Behind him stood Roy, free from cuffs, his ruddy cheeks flushed with triumph. The headline blazed, "Sheriff releases evidence of fugitive CEO's violent assault." The footage rolled, grainy doctored clips showing Nia swinging at Roy in the outpost, edited to look unprovoked, her escape twisted into an attack. Voss's voice boomed, steady and grave. "Nia Jackson is a dangerous criminal. She assaulted my deputy, fled custody. We're protecting our community." Nia's stomach dropped, her hands clenching into fists as the video spread. X lighting up with a new narrative. She's a thug. Look at her attacking him. Her supporters faltered, some deleting their posts, others arguing back, but the damage was instant. Ellis cursed, slamming the laptop shut. They faked it, he said, his voice tight. That's not what happened. Nia nodded, her mind reeling, the pain in her body nothing compared to the gut punch of this lie. Margaret hadn't just struck back, she'd weaponized the system, turned Nia's truth into a smear campaign that painted her as the villain. Her phone rang again, her PR lead, Tara, her voice trembling. Nia, the conference just called. They're pulling your slot. Investors are spooked, talking lawsuits, the stock's crashing harder. Nia sank back onto the bed, her breath shallow, the room spinning. How bad? She asked, her tone flat, bracing for the worst. Tara hesitated, then whispered, We might not recover. Nia's eyes closed, the weight of it crushing her. Her empire, her dream was fracturing, and Margaret's husband had lit the match. She'd rallied the world, thought the pressure would save her, but they'd flipped the script, leaving her exposed, vilified. She forced herself up, limping to the window, the motel's neon glow casting jagged streaks across her bruised face. Protests might still rage, but the news was louder, Sheriff Voss's lie drowning out her voice. Her satchel lay on the floor, empty without her notes, her company's future slipping through her fingers. Victor's call buzzed through again, his tone urgent. Nia, we're fighting the footage. Legal team's on it. But you've got to move. Get to New York. Salvage what you can. She nodded, her jaw setting despite the ache. I will, she said, her voice a quiet vow. They won't bury me. The TV in the corner flickered on, Ellis fumbling with the remote, and Margaret Voss's face filled the screen, her platinum hair gleaming under studio lights. She sat poised in a cream blazer, her eyes glistening with crocodile tears, her voice trembling with rehearsed fragility. I never meant for this, she said, dabbing at her cheek with a tissue. I just wanted my seat, and now this woman's turned it into a vendetta. I'm the victim here. Nia's blood boiled, her fists clenching as Margaret played the martyr, her lies a masterstroke that twisted the knife deeper. The anchor nodded sympathetically, the ticker flashing. CEO's rampage sparks outrage. Nia turned away, her reflection sharp in the window, her bruised face a testament to the truth. Margaret buried. She'd rallied her supporters, lit a spark, but Sheriff Voss and Roy had doused it with gasoline, burning her name to ash. Her conference was gone, her stock in free fall, and Margaret's smug tears were the final blow. She grabbed her phone, her fingers hovering over X, but the flood of hate stopped her cold. She was a fugitive, a thug, a liar in their eyes now, and the fight to New York felt farther than ever. Margaret's war wasn't slowing, it was accelerating, and Nia's victory had slipped through her battered hands like smoke. Nia Jackson stood by the motel window, the neon glow painting her bruised face in streaks of red, as the lawyer, Ellis, packed his gear into the sedan outside. Her navy suit hung in tatters, her ribs throbbing from Roy's fists, but her eyes burned with a fire that refused to dim. The TV blared Margaret Voss's crocodile tears, her victim act twisting the knife deeper, while Nia's phone buzzed with X notifications, half support, half venom. Her viral rally drowned by Sheriff Voss's doctored footage. Her company's stock was in freefall, her conference slot yanked, but she wasn't done. She had to get to New York, salvage what was left. Ellis poked his head through the door, his voice clipped. Car's ready. We'll take back roads, dodge the heat. Nia nodded, grabbing her satchel, its emptiness a weight without her burned notes. Let's move, she said, her tone steel despite the ache. They slipped out into the night, the sedan's engine purring as Ellis wove through rural lanes, the headlights slicing through fog and shadow. Nia pulled a scarf from her bag, wrapping it around her head to mask her face, her company headshot still plastered on every news screen, as a fugitive. The radio crackled with updates. CEO Nia Jackson, wanted for assault, eludes capture. She clenched her fists, the cuffs marks still raw on her wrists. Victor's fighting the footage, Ellis said, glancing at her. Legal team's got proof it's fake, but the feds are sniffing around now. Nia's jaw tightened. Margaret's husband, she muttered. He's got reach. Ellis nodded, his knuckles white on the wheel. Too much. 2 hours later, they hit a small train station in Indiana, its platform a slab of cracked concrete under a single buzzing lamp. A Silver Line train idled, its silver cars gleaming, bound for New York. Nia slipped Ellis a wad of cash from her emergency stash. "Buy me a ticket," she said, her voice low. "VIP under your name. I'll board quiet." He hesitated, then nodded, disappearing into the ticket office. Nia waited in the shadows, her scarf pulled tight, her heart pounding. As passengers shuffled past, a businessman with a briefcase, a woman tugging a toddler. Ellis returned, handing her a ticket for 1A, his eyes darting. "You're clear," he said. "No alerts here yet. Good luck." She boarded, her steps silent on the carpeted VIP car, the air thick with the scent of leather and coffee. The car was sparse, 5 passengers, none looking her way, and she sank into 1A. The window seat a small comfort as she tugged the scarf lower. The train jolted forward, the station fading into the dark. And Nia exhaled, her body sinking into the plush leather. She'd made it, disguised, one step closer to New York. Her phone buzzed. "Victor." "Nia," he said, his voice hushed. "You're on. Legal's pushing hard, but stay low. Voss's crew's still hunting." She nodded, her eyes on the passing fields. "I'll make it," she said, her voice a quiet vow. "They won't stop me." 30 minutes in, the car's calm shattered. A woman in a gray coat, her hair a tight bun, slipped into the aisle, her eyes flicking to Nia before darting away. She whispered to the conductor, a lean man with a pinched face, who nodded and approached Nia's seat, his badge reading Carl. "Ma'am," he said, his tone polite but edged. "Can I see your ticket?" Nia's stomach twisted, but she handed it over, her scarf still shadowing her face. Carl scanned it, his brow furrowing. "This says Ellis Grant," he said, his voice rising. "ID, please." Nia's mind raced. Her real ID was gone. Confiscated. By Hank days ago. "Lost it," she said, forcing calm. "It's my husband's ticket. He couldn't make it." Carl's eyes narrowed, suspicion glinting as he stepped back, pulling a radio from his belt. "Got a possible," he muttered into it, his gaze locked on her. Nia's pulse spiked, her hands clenching the armrests. The woman in the gray coat smirked, slipping a phone from her pocket, snapping a photo of Nia's face. Margaret's spies, she realized, her blood running cold. Before she could react, Carl returned, flanked by 2 federal agents in dark suits, their badges flashing under the car's lights. "Nia Jackson," the taller agent said, his voice flat, authoritative. "You're under arrest. Stand up." Nia stood, her legs steady despite the tremor in her chest, her scarf falling loose as passengers gasped, phones whipping out to film. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice cutting through the hum. "I'm no criminal." The shorter agent, a stocky man with a buzz cut, grabbed her satchel, rummaging through it as the taller one cuffed her wrists, the steel cold and familiar. He pulled out a small plastic bag, its white powder glinting. Drugs, planted, a frame-up so blatant it stole her breath. "Found this," the short one said, holding it up, his lips curling. "Drug trafficking now, huh?" Nia's eyes widened, fury surging. "That's not mine," she snapped, lunging forward. But the cuffs jerked her back, the taller agent shoving her against the seat. The car erupted, passengers whispering, filming, their voices a chorus of shock and glee. "Knew she was trouble," a man muttered, his phone aimed at her face. "Disgraceful," a woman hissed, clutching her purse. Carl radioed ahead, his voice smug. "Got her. Drugs confirmed. Send backup." Nia's mind spun, the pieces slamming together. Margaret's allies, the woman in gray, the planted evidence. This was no random bust. It was a kill shot, designed to bury her deeper than the assault lie. The agents dragged her toward the door, cameras flashing as they stepped onto the next platform, a small Ohio stop bathed in floodlights. Paparazzi swarmed, their lenses a blinding storm as the agents paraded her past. The powder bag dangled like a trophy, CEO caught in drug bust. The headlines would scream, her company's last thread snapping. Victor's call buzzed through as they shoved her into a van and she answered, her voice trembling with rage. "They planted drugs," she said, the cuffs biting her wrists. "Feds, Margaret's doing. I'm done." Victor cursed, his tone frantic. "I'll bail you out, Nia. We'll fight it. Hold on." The call cut as the van peeled out. The agents, silent, their faces stone. Hours later, Victor's cash sprung her from an Ohio jail, her release a quiet shuffle into the night. Ellis waiting with the sedan. She collapsed inside, her scarf gone, her face raw and exposed. "Investors are out," Ellis said, his voice grim. "Stocks tanked. They think you're guilty." Nia's chest tightened, her empire crumbling. Margaret's frame up a masterstroke. She'd fought to New York's edge, but this was a cliff, her dreams dangling over the void. The taller agent's voice echoed in her skull as they'd cuffed her. "Margaret's untouchable. Give up." She stared out the window, the dark highway a blur, her hands shaking with fury and loss. She'd been so close, but Margaret's net was tightening, and surrender felt closer than ever. "Hold up, this just got wild." Did Nia's grit to keep going blow your mind? Or did that drug plant feel like a punch you didn't see coming? Comment number 1 if you're raging at Margaret's dirty tricks, or number 2 if you think Nia's still got a shot to flip this. Hit like if you're hooked on her fight, and subscribe to see her claw back. We're in deep now. Ever faced a lie that felt impossible to beat? What's Nia's next move against this wall of deceit? Nia Jackson slumped in the passenger seat of Ellis's sedan, the Ohio jail's harsh lights fading in the rear view as they sped into the night. Her navy suit was a shredded mess, her wrists raw from cuffs, her face bruised and swollen from Roy's fists. The planted drugs, Margaret Voss's latest blow, had tanked her company's stock, scared off investors, and left her conference slot in New York a distant memory. Her cracked phone glowed in her lap, Victor's last words echoing, "We'll fight it." But fighting felt futile, the weight of Margaret's frame-up crushing her spirit. Ellis glanced over, his sharp eyes glinting in the dashboard's glow. "You're out," he said, his voice steady. Victor's cash moved fast. "What now?" Nia straightened, her jaw setting despite the ache. "We dig," she said, her tone cold, resolute. "They're not winning this." She pulled up her phone, the battery flickering at 10%, and opened encrypted files her team had sent days ago. Financial records, Silverline contracts, scraps she'd collected for leverage. Her fingers scrolled, her mind racing through the haze of pain and exhaustion, searching for a crack in Margaret's armor. Ellis drove in silence, the highway a dark ribbon stretching east, until Nia froze, her breath catching. A buried email. Thread, flagged by her assistant. Payments from Sheriff Voss's personal account to a federal agent's offshore shell company, dated the day before her arrest. "Bribes," she whispered, her voice trembling with fury and triumph. "He paid them to plant the drugs." Ellis's eyes widened, his hands tightening on the wheel. "You've got proof?" "Enough," Nia said, forwarding the file to Victor with a terse note. "Leak this. Now." She switched to X, her fingers flying as she typed. "Sheriff Voss bribed feds to frame me. Here's the evidence. This ends today." She attached screenshots, her bruised face a silent testament, and hit post. The tweet surged, retweets exploding as her remaining supporters rallied, hashtags like Mike Expose Voss trending within minutes. News outlets picked it up, headlines shifting. CEO alleges corruption in drug bust. Nia leaned back, her chest heaving, a flicker of hope cutting through the despair. "They'll back off," she said, her voice firm. "They have to." Victor called, his voice crackling with urgency. "Nia, it's working. Feds are scrambling. 2 agents suspended pending investigation. Voss's office is silent. You're turning it." She nodded, her eyes on the passing fields, the dark sky lightening to gray as dawn crept in. "Get me to New York," she said. "I'm not done." Ellis floored it, the sedan tearing through the miles, and 3 hours later, they reached a quiet station in Pennsylvania, a Silverline train idling under a pale sunrise. Nia boarded, her scarf back in place, her ticket, bought under Ellis's name, clutched tight. She sank into 1A, the VIP car nearly empty, the leather seat a fragile sanctuary as the train jolted forward. The car hummed with a soft rhythm, the window framing a blur of trees and towns, and Nia let herself breathe, her body aching but her mind sharp. Her phone buzzed with updates. Federal probes launched, Voss's allies ducking questions, her stock ticking up slightly as the truth spread. She'd struck back, exposed the rot, and thought, maybe, she'd turned the tide. The conference was lost, but she could rebuild, rally her team, fight another day. She closed her eyes, the exhaustion pulling at her. When the train slowed, brakes squealing as it neared a rural stop in upstate New York, the platform a slab of concrete under a sagging roof. The doors hissed open and chaos erupted. A mob poured onto the platform, 50 strong, their faces twisted with rage, fists clutching bottles and bats. They screamed her name, Jackson, thug, liar, their voices a roar that shook the cars. Glass. Nia's eyes snapped open, her heart slamming against her ribs as she peered through the window. Signs waved. Justice for Voss. No mercy for criminals. Lies fueled by Margaret's smear campaign. Sheriff Voss's footage still burning in their minds. A bottle shattered against the train, glass spraying, and the passengers around her, 3, suits and an elderly woman, flinched, their eyes darting to Nia with fear and disgust. "Get out here, Jackson," a man bellowed, his beard streaked with gray, his bat raised high. "You don't scare us." Another hurled a rock, cracking the window beside her, the shards glinting on the carpet. Nia stood, her legs trembling but her face a mask, her scarf slipping to reveal her battered features. "Stay calm," she muttered to herself, grabbing her satchel as the mob surged closer, pounding the train sides. The conductor, a young woman with wide eyes, burst into the car, her voice shaking. "They're blocking the tracks," she said, her badge reading Lila. "We can't move. I've called security, but—" "No time." Nia cut in, her tone sharp as she pushed past Lila toward the rear exit. The mob's shouts grew louder, a bottle smashing through another window, the crash echoing as the suits ducked, cursing her name. She reached the door, her hand on the latch, when Lila grabbed her arm. "You can't go out there," she said, her voice pleading. "They'll kill you." Nia shook her off, her eyes blazing. "I've faced worse," she said, shoving the door open and leaping onto the platform, the cold air hitting her like a slap. The mob swarmed, their stench of sweat and beer thick as they closed in, bats swinging, bottles flying. Nia dodged a wild punch, her ribs screaming, and ducked under a bat, her agility honed from years of survival. She sprinted toward a narrow alley beside the station, her heels pounding the dirt, the crowd howling behind her. A bottle grazed her shoulder, shattering against a wall, and she stumbled, catching herself on a dumpster, her breath ragged. She darted into the alley, the mob's footsteps thundering, and spotted a rusted fire escape 10 feet up. With a desperate leap, she grabbed the ladder, hauling herself up as a bat clanged against the metal below, the impact vibrating through her bones. She climbed, her hands slick with sweat, and reached a rooftop, collapsing behind a vent as the mob raged below, their shouts fading into a dull roar. Her phone buzzed. Victor again. "Nia, where are you?" he shouted, his voice frantic. "Voss is arrested, briberies confirmed. You're clear." She gasped, her chest heaving, the news a lifeline through the chaos. "New York," she said, her voice raw. "Mob hit me at a stop, I'm alive barely." Victor cursed, his tone shifting to steel. "Stay put, I'm sending help, you're almost there." She peered over the edge, the mob dispersing as sirens wailed in the distance, security finally rolling in. She'd made it to New York's edge, her counterstrike landing, Voss in cuffs, but the victory soured fast. Her phone pinged. A text from Tara, her PR lead. "Conference gave your slot to a white rival. Voss's last move." Nia's heart sank, her fists clenching as she stared at the screen, the rooftop wind whipping her torn scarf. She'd exposed the corruption, turned the feds, but Margaret's final jab had stolen her stage, her chance to rebuild. Sirens grew louder, help closing in, but below, a figure in the shadows caught her eye. A man in a dark coat, watching, his posture too calm, too deliberate. Margaret's war wasn't over, and Nia's fight had just begun. Nia Jackson crouched behind the rooftop vent, her breath shallow and ragged, the cold New York wind slicing through her tattered navy suit. Below, the mob dispersed, their shouts fading into the wail of approaching sirens, security scattering the last of Margaret Voss's incited horde. Her ribs ached from Roy's fists, her wrists burned from cuffs, and her scarf fluttered loose, revealing her bruised face to the dawn. Her phone buzzed in her hand, Victor's voice crackling through. "Voss is arrested. Briberies confirmed. You're clear." She'd exposed the sheriff, turned the feds, but Tara's text still stung. Her conference slot, her lifeline to rebuild biotech innovations, stolen by a white rival in Margaret's final jab. She glanced over the edge, spotting a man in a dark coat lingering in the alley's shadows, his stillness a predator's calm. Her gut twisted. Trouble wasn't gone. It was stalking her. Footsteps clanged on the fire escape, sharp and deliberate, snapping her from her thoughts. She ducked lower, peering through the vent slats as a figure climbed into view. Tall, lean, his dark coat flapping, a pistol glinting in his hand. Vance, an ex-cop turned hitman, his gray eyes cold and unblinking. Scars crisscrossing his knuckles. Nia's heart slammed against her ribs. Margaret's husband might be in cuffs, but her reach stretched further, hiring this killer to finish what the mob couldn't. "Jackson," Vance called, his voice a low rasp, cutting through the wind. "No point hiding. Voss wants you done." She pressed herself flat, her mind racing, her satchel clutched tight. She'd outrun cops, mobs, but this was death on two legs. Vance stepped onto the roof, his boots crunching gravel, his gun sweeping. The shadows. Nia held her breath, her fingers curling around a loose brick beside the vent, its rough edge biting her palm. He moved closer, his shadow falling across her hiding spot, and she sprang, swinging the brick with a force born of desperation. It cracked against his wrist, the gun flying from his grip, skittering across the roof. Vance cursed, lunging for her, but she ducked, rolling toward the fire escape, her ribs screaming as she hit the metal railing. She scrambled down, her heels slipping on the rungs, Vance's boots pounding behind her, his snarl echoing in the dawn. She hit the alley, sprinting through the narrow chute, trash cans clattering as she shoved them aside. Vance landed hard behind her, retrieving his gun with a fluid scoop. His shot ringing out, the bullet pinging off a dumpster inches from her head. Nia zigzagged, her lungs burning, the highway a faint roar ahead. She burst onto a back road, a quiet stretch of asphalt flanked by woods, and spotted a rusted pickup idling by a gas pump, its driver pumping fuel. She waved frantically, her voice raw. "Help me." The man, a grizzled trucker in a denim cap, squinted, then nodded, tossing his nozzle aside. "Get in," he barked, leaping into the cab. Nia dove into the passenger seat, the door slamming. As Vance emerged from the alley, his gun raised. The trucker floored it, the pickup lurching forward, tires squealing as a bullet shattered the rear window, glass spraying across the bench seat. Nia ducked, her hands shielding her face. The trucker, cursing as he swerved onto the highway. "Who's that psycho?" he shouted, his knuckles white on the wheel. "Someone who wants me dead," Nia gasped, her eyes darting to the side mirror. Vance's black sedan peeled out behind them, its engine a feral growl, closing fast. "Faster," she urged, her voice cracking as the truck shuddered, pushing 80 miles an hour. The chase tore through the back roads, the pickup weaving past early commuters, Vance's sedan a relentless shadow. He fired again, a bullet grazing the tailgate, sparks flying as the trucker swerved, clipping a guardrail. Nia gripped the dash, her mind spinning. New York was close, her team waiting. But Vance was closer, death-riding shotgun. "Hold on," the trucker yelled, yanking the wheel hard, veering onto a dirt lane flanked by trees. Branches scraped. The cab, the sedan fishtailing behind, and Nia spotted a sharp curve ahead, a ditch yawning beside it. "There," she said, pointing, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Lose him." The trucker grinned, a wild glint in his eye, and gunned it, the pickup skidding around the bend, tires kicking up dust. Vance followed too fast, his sedan sliding as he hit the curve, the wheels losing grip. The car flipped, tumbling into the ditch with a sickening crunch, metal twisting, glass exploding. Nia twisted in her seat, watching the wreckage settle, smoke curling from the hood. "He's down," she said, her breath hitching, relief flooding her battered body. The trucker slowed, wiping sweat from his brow. "Crazy lady," he muttered, half laughing. "Where to now?" She leaned back, her chest heaving. "New York," she said. "I've got a fight to finish." Her phone buzzed. Victor, his voice sharp with triumph. "Nia, you safe? Voss's arrest just hit national news. Full corruption. Probe, feds are off your back." She exhaled, the words a lifeline, her eyes on the highway stretching east. "I'm alive," she said, her voice raw. "Hitman chased me, but he's out. Crashed." Victor cursed, then laughed, a fierce edge to it. "You're unstoppable. Get here, we'll rebuild." The call ended, and Nia let herself smile. Faint, but real. The city's skyline, a distant shimmer on the horizon. She'd outwitted Vance, turned the tide, and New York was hers again. The trucker dropped her at a station 10 miles out, tipping his cap as she boarded a final train. Her scarf retied, her spirit fraying but unbroken. The Silver Line hummed toward Manhattan, the VIP car quiet, its leather seats a fragile haven. Nia sank into 1A, the window framing the sunrise, her satchel on her lap, empty of notes but heavy with resolve. She'd made it. Voss behind bars, the feds scrambling, her name clearing with every news cycle. Her team waited, ready to rally, and she could still salvage biotech, pitch to new investors, fight another day. The train rolled into Penn Station, the platform bustling with morning. Commuters, and Nia stepped off, her heels clicking against the tiles, her head high despite the bruises. She'd won this round, survived the chase, and the conference loomed as a ghost she'd reclaim. But victory crumbled fast. Her phone pinged. Tara, her PR lead, her voice trembling through the line. "Nia, you're here?" Conference gave your slot to Mark Hensley. White guy, Voss's last play. They're calling it damage control. Nia's stomach sank, her fists clenching as she stood frozen in the station's chaos, commuters brushing past. Mark Hensley, a rival she'd outshone, for years now handed her stage, her chance by Margaret's final venomous move. She'd fought cops, mobs, a hitman, exposed corruption, but this cut deeper, a theft of her voice when she'd earned it most. The platform blurred, her breath shallow, and she glanced back at the train, its doors closing, a symbol of every door slamming shut. She dialed Victor, her voice shaking with fury. "They gave it to Hensley," she said, the words bitter on her tongue. "Margaret's last shot." Victor cursed, his tone dark. "We'll crash it, Nia. You'll speak. Slot or not." She nodded, her jaw setting, but the weight pressed harder. Her stock fragile, her team rattled. And now this. As she hung up, a chill crept up her spine, her eyes catching a flicker in the crowd. Vance, battered but alive, limping from the shadows, his gray eyes locked on her. He'd survived the crash, his vow of revenge a silent promise in his stare, and Nia knew Margaret's war was far from over. Nia Jackson stepped off the Silver Line train into Penn Station's morning chaos, her tattered navy suit a stark contrast to the polished commuters brushing past. Her ribs ached from Roy's fists, her wrists bore cuff marks, and her bruised face drew stares, but her eyes blazed with a fire that refused to fade. Vance's limping silhouette lingered in her mind, his survival a ticking bomb, but Tara's call burned hotter. Mark Hensley, a white rival, had stolen her conference slot. Margaret Voss's last chess move to silence her. Victor's voice echoed through her phone as she pushed through the crowd. "We'll crash it, Nia. You'll speak." She clutched her empty satchel, her keynote notes ash, but her resolve steel. This wasn't over, not while she could still fight. She hailed a cab, the driver eyeing her battered state but saying nothing as she barked, "Midtown, Javits Center, fast." The city blurred past, taxis honking, skyscrapers glinting in the sunrise, her mind racing with every mile. Sheriff Voss was in cuffs, his bribery exposed, the feds off her back, but Margaret's shadow loomed, her rival now poised to claim Nia's stage. The cab screeched to a stop outside the convention center, a glass fortress buzzing with suits and badges. The biotech conference in full swing. Nia paid with her last crumpled bills, stepping onto the curb, her heels clicking against the pavement as she scanned the entrance. Security loomed, but Victor waited by a side door. His gray suit crisp, his face tight with urgency. "You're here," he said, pulling her inside, his voice low. "Hensley's on in 20 minutes. We've got hacked emails, Margaret's orders to Roy, the hitman, all of it. You're crashing his slot." Nia nodded, her jaw setting despite the pain pulsing through her. "Good," she said, her tone sharp. "They'll hear me." Victor led her through a maze of corridors, the hum of the crowd growing louder, biotech execs and investors packed into the main hall. He handed her a USB drive, his eyes fierce. "Proof's on here. Use it." She tucked it into her pocket, her fingers trembling but steady, and slipped into the backstage shadows. The stage, a glowing platform beyond the curtain. Mark Hensley stood at the podium, his blonde hair slicked back, his tailored suit screaming privilege as he droned about. Innovation, his voice smooth, rehearsed. The crowd, 500 strong, nodded along, oblivious to the theft of Nia's slot. She watched from the wings, her blood boiling, every word a dagger in her chest. This was her moment, her company's lifeline, and he'd snatched it with Margaret's blessing. The USB burned in her pocket, her breath shallow as she waited, Victor whispering, "Now." She stepped forward, her heels loud against the stage floor, cutting Hensley off mid-sentence as gasps rippled through the room. "Excuse me," Nia said, her voice ringing clear, unshaken despite her battered look. "This isn't his stage, it's mine." Hensley froze, his smile faltering, the crowd murmuring as she strode to the podium, shoving him aside with a force that belied her injuries. "I'm Nia Jackson, CEO of Biotech Innovations," she said, her eyes sweeping the stunned faces. "You've heard lies. Fugitive, thug, drug runner, here's the truth." She plugged the USB into the projector, hacked emails flashing on the massive screen. Margaret's orders to Roy, payments to Vance, Sheriff Voss's bribes to feds. The room erupted, whispers turning to shouts, cameras flashing as she laid it bare. "Margaret Voss tried to erase me," Nia said, her voice rising raw with fury and triumph. "She had me beaten, framed, hunted, all for a train seat I earned. Her husband's in jail, her hitman's down, and I'm still standing." Thus we. Crowd roared, some cheering, others gaping. The emails a smoking gun no one could deny. Hensley stammered, "This is outrageous," but Nia cut him off, her glare silencing him. "You're her puppet," she snapped, turning back to the room. "Biotech's not dead, we're fighting. For justice, for innovation. Who's with me?" Applause thundered, hands clapping, voices shouting her name. A wave she rode as Hensley slunk off stage, defeated. Victor slipped beside her, his voice low. "Silverline's CEO's here. He's firing Margaret's board allies. Live feeds. Rolling." Nia nodded, her chest swelling, the victory sharp and sweet. She'd crashed the slot, exposed the rot, and reclaimed her voice. Her company's pulse flickering back to life. The crowd surged to their feet, a standing ovation as she stepped back, her breath hitching, the pain in her ribs a distant echo. She'd won, turned the tide, and New York was hers again. But the triumph shattered in an instant. Gunshots rang. Out, the back door slamming open as Vance burst in, his dark coat torn, his pistol raised high. Screams tore through the hall, the crowd ducking as Vance roared, "Jackson! This ends now!" His gray eyes locked on her, his limp slowing him but his aim steady, a bullet whizzing past her head, splintering the podium. Nia dove, hitting the stage hard, her ribs screaming as chaos erupted, security rushing forward. Victor tackled her behind a speaker, his voice frantic. "He's alive! Voss's last card!" Vance fired again, glass shattering overhead, the crowd stampeding toward exits as Nia scrambled, her hands fumbling for a weapon. She grabbed a mic stand, its weight solid in her grip, and swung as Vance lunged, the metal cracking against his skull with a sickening thud. He staggered, blood trickling from his temple, but his gun stayed up, his snarl feral. "Margaret says die," he spat, pulling the trigger as Nia rolled, the shot grazing her arm, hot pain searing her skin. She swung again, Harder, the stand smashing his hand, the gun clattering free. Security swarmed, pinning him to the floor, his curses muffled as they cuffed him, dragging him away. Nia collapsed, her breath ragged, blood dripping from her arm. Onto the stage, the crowd's cheers, now screams fading into a dull roar. She'd disarmed him, survived, but the fight left her trembling, her victory teetering on the edge. Victor pulled her up, his face pale. "You're okay," he said, his voice shaking. "He's done." Nia nodded, her eyes fixed on Vance's retreating form, but her phone buzzed, shattering the relief. Tara, her voice a whisper through the line. "Nia, Margaret's on video call, live to the press. She's triggered something." Nia snatched the phone, the screen flickering to a news feed. Margaret, poised in a cream blazer, her voice cold as she spoke from a remote studio. "Nia, Jackson's a fraud," she said, her lips curling. "Her company's assets are frozen. Judge's order. She'll never win." Nia's stomach dropped, the room spinning as a text from her CFO confirmed it. Judge tied to Voss. Accounts locked. The crowd hushed, heads turning to screens as the feed spread, Margaret's cackle cutting through the static. "You'll never win." Nia's fist clenched, her arm bleeding, her empire gutted by a racist judge's pen. Margaret's final blow landing as security hauled Vance out. She'd exposed the emails, reclaimed her stage, beaten the hitman. But this was a sledgehammer, her funds frozen, her company paralyzed. Victor cursed, his hand on her shoulder. "We'll fight it," he said, his tone fierce. "You're not done." But Nia stared at the screen, Margaret's smirk a mirror of that first train window, and knew the war had escalated, her triumph a fragile shell against this new abyss. Nia Jackson stood on the Javits Center stage, her arm bleeding from Vance's grazing shot. The mic stand still clutched in her trembling hand as security hauled the hitman away. The crowd's cheers had dissolved into stunned silence. Their eyes darting between her battered form and the massive screens flashing Margaret Voss's video feed. Margaret's voice, cold and triumphant, echoed through the hall. "Her company's assets are frozen. Judge's order. She'll never win." Nia's navy suit hung in shreds, her ribs a throbbing mess from Roy's fists, her empire gutted by a racist judge tied to Sheriff Voss. Victor gripped her shoulder, his face pale but fierce. "We'll fight it," he said, his voice a lifeline, in the chaos. But Nia's gaze locked on Margaret's smirking image, her cackle a venomous thread stitching every blow, train, jail, mob, hitman, into this final crushing defeat. She stumbled off stage, Victor guiding her to a back room, the hum of the crowd fading into a dull buzz. Her phone buzzed relentlessly. Tara, her PR lead, her voice shaking. "Nia, it's true. Judge Callahan froze everything. Accounts, assets, all locked. Voss's ally from way back." Nia sank into a chair, the cracked leather creaking under her, her breath shallow as the weight pressed down. Biotech Innovations, her life's work, was paralyzed, her investors gone, her conference slot stolen by Hensley. She'd exposed Margaret's crimes, beaten Vance, reclaimed her voice, but this was a guillotine, severing her last thread. "How do we fight a judge?" she whispered, her tone flat, the pain in her arm a dull pulse compared to the ache in her chest. Victor paced, his gray suit rumpled, his mind churning. "Callahan's dirty," he said, his voice sharp. "If he's Voss's man, there's a trail. We find it." Nia nodded, her jaw setting despite the exhaustion dragging at her. She pulled her cracked phone from her pocket, its screen flickering as she dialed her tech lead, Jamal, a wiry genius, who'd stuck by her through the storm. "Jamal," she said, her voice hoarse but steady, "dig into Judge Callahan, ties to Voss, anything, now." He didn't hesitate. "On it, boss," he said, the clack of his keyboard already audible. "Give me an hour." She hung up, her eyes meeting Victor's. "We're not done," she said, a vow to herself as much as to him. She stood, wincing as her ribs protested, and limped to a laptop Ellis had left backstage, its screen glowing with her X feed. Her viral post exposing Voss's bribe still trended, her supporters battling the hate. But Margaret's video had shifted the tide again. Headlines screaming, Biotech CEO's empire collapses. Nia's fingers hovered over the keys, then typed, her words raw, unfiltered. Margaret Voss thinks she's won. She's wrong. I'm still here, and I'm coming for justice. She hit post, the tweet surging as Jamal called back, his voice tight with triumph. Got it, he said. Callahan's golf buddies with Voss. 10 years of payments through a shell company. Bank records, photos, the works. Nia's chest swelled, a spark igniting through the despair. Send it, she said, her tone lethal. Jamal's files hit her inbox, a goldmine of corruption, wire transfers, grainy shots of Callahan laughing with Voss at a country club, a paper trail no court could ignore. She forwarded it to Victor, who grinned, fierce and wild. This buries him, he said, dialing his legal team. We'll file now, disbarment, injunction, everything. Nia nodded, her mind racing as she grabbed the laptop, marching back to the stage, her heels loud against the floor. The crowd was thinning, but cameras lingered, hungry for the next twist. She plugged Jamal's files into the projector, the screen flaring to life as she took the podium, her voice cutting through the murmurs. I'm not finished, she said, her tone ringing with authority, her battered face a testament to her fight. Margaret Voss froze my company with a crooked judge. Here's the proof. The images flashed. Callahan smirks, Voss's checks, gasps rippling through the room, phone snapping pics as she laid it bare. This isn't just about me, she said, her eyes blazing. It's about every person they've crushed, with their privilege. I'm still standing, and biotech's not dead. The crowd erupted, applause thundering, a roar that shook the hall as Victor whispered, "Legal's moving." Callahan's toast. Her phone buzzed. A news alert. Judge Callahan disbarred amid corruption scandal. Victor's team had struck fast, the injunction lifting, her assets unfrozen within hours as the story broke. Nia exhaled, her knees weak, the victory sharp and real. She turned the tables, her empire breathing again, but Margaret wasn't done. Another alert flashed. Margaret Voss arrested for conspiracy, the screen showing her in cuffs, her cream blazer wrinkled, her face twisted with rage. Vance had flipped, his testimony sealing her fate, a domino Nia hadn't expected. She'd won. Voss, Callahan, Hensley, all down, her stage reclaimed. The crowd surged forward, execs offering cards, investors murmuring deals, but Nia stepped back, her breath steadying as Victor grinned beside her. You did it, he said, his voice thick with pride. Biotech's back. She nodded, her eyes on the screen, Margaret's arrest looping, a satisfaction deep and quiet settling in her bones. Her team rallied via text, Jamal, Tara, the rest, ready to rebuild, her stock ticking up as the truth spread. She'd pitched her deal, the original conference offer reinstated, and the room buzzed with her name, a phoenix rising from the ash of Margaret's war. But then she paused, her hand on the podium, the applause fading into a hum as a new vision crystallized. She turned to Victor, her voice low, deliberate. I'm rejecting it, she said, her tone unshakable. The deal, the slot, all of it. He blinked, stunned. What? You've got them now, take it. She shook her head, her eyes sharp, a fire rekindled. This fight's bigger, she said. I'm launching something new, a venture to dismantle systemic racism, fund startups crushed like mine. Biotech stays, but this is my legacy. Victor stared, then nodded, a slow grin spreading. You're insane, he said, laughing, and brilliant. She stepped off stage, her satchel slung over her shoulder, the empty space where her notes once sat now a symbol of what she'd build. Her phone buzzed. Jamal again, his voice crackling with excitement. Team's in, Nia. We're ready. She smiled, faint, but real, the pain in her ribs a badge of survival as she walked out into the New York morning, the city alive around her. Margaret's arrest played on every screen. Her empire collapsed. Vance's betrayal the final nail. The train staff's firing, that first spark, had ignited a wildfire. Nia's legacy wasn't just biotech's survival. It was a movement, a reckoning no one could stop. She hailed a cab, the driver nodding as she said, "Brooklyn," her voice steady, her mind already mapping the new venture. Investors texted offers, her team buzzed with plans, and the headlines shifted. Nia Jackson rejects deal, launches anti-racism fund. She leaned back, the city blurring past, her bruises a roadmap of every battle won. Margaret had thought a seat could break her, but Nia had turned it into a throne, a platform bigger than any conference. The cab rolled on, the skyline gleaming, and she knew this was the real triumph. Not just survival, but a revolution born from the ashes, a legacy that would outlast them all. Nia Jackson's journey teaches us that resilience can turn even the ugliest battles into victories with purpose. What started as a simple seat dispute on a train spiraled into a war against systemic racism, corruption, and vengeance. The first lesson is unyielding determination. Nia faced eviction, jail, beatings, a hitman, and a smear campaign, yet she never surrendered. She flipped every blow into a weapon, proving that grit can outlast privilege. Second, truth is power. By exposing Sheriff Voss's bribes and Judge Callahan's corruption, she dismantled a network built to crush her, showing that evidence and courage can topple even the mightiest foes. Third, community matters. Her viral rally on X turned strangers into allies, amplifying her voice when the system tried to silence it. But the deepest lesson lies in her final twist, rejecting the deal to launch a venture against racism. It's a reminder that winning isn't just surviving, it's rewriting the rules so others don't suffer the same fight. This story isn't just Nia's, it's a mirror for anyone who's felt dismissed or targeted. It screams that justice isn't handed out, it's seized. So, what's your takeaway? How would you fight back against a Margaret Voss in your life? Drop your thoughts below with a number 1 if you'd rally like Nia, or number 2 if you'd strike differently. Then, hit like, subscribe, and share to spread this fire. Have you ever turned a loss into a win? Tell us, because your story could spark the next reckoning. Thanks for riding this wild train with us. Your support fuels these tales of defiance. Here's to you, warriors of justice. May you rise, unbroken, every time the world tries to push you down.